All right. I think we ought to start so we can stay on time today. As you have heard in previous sessions, some advocates of drug legalization believe that all now illicit drugs should be managed under a system of regulation and taxation, with the regulations tailored to the drugs in question. Others would choose a smaller set of substances. But I think it's important to emphasize that nobody is talking about having racks of crack available in the gumball machines at McDonald's. But as indicated by the cannabis leaf that appears in the title of the conference program, marijuana is the substance most people think of most readily when the question of legalization arises. And rightly so, because as Ethan Nadelman pointed out in the first session this morning, a Gallup poll last year found that right at half of people in this country who were polled, represented in that poll, believe that marijuana should be legal. Part of that has to do with age and experience. I talked in writing an article about marijuana for Texas Monthly 3 years ago, and you can find it by going to bakerinstitute.org, the drug policy program, and look down in publications, and it's called Texas Highways. One of the people I talked to said, well, it's not a question of if, it's just when, because every day some 70-year-old man, he didn't actually say man, but dies and some kid turns 21. It's just a question of when. Well, since I was 71 at the time, I thought he was being a little capricious or disrespectful, let's put it that way. But nevertheless, there is a demographic shift there that is making some kind of difference. But several states already have de facto legalization. In Alaska, it is legal to grow up to 25 cannabis plants for personal use and to possess enough marijuana for 100 joints, which is sufficient to get most people through an evening. So, our next two speakers are on the front lines of this issue. Russ Belville is the outreach coordinator for NORML, the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws, and Kevin Sabet was until recently a key staffer with the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, working closely with Director Gil Kerlikowske. Again, beginning with Russ Belville, each of these will speak for 20 minutes and then spend the remaining time discussing among themselves. Russ. And lest you think I'm showing favoritism, Russ has his own timer. He will be able to wave
Good morning, everyone. Welcome, and I just want to say I'm incredibly honored to be speaking here at the Baker Institute. I saw the list of panelists who were going to be appearing here. I saw more letters behind people's names than I see in a bowl of alphabet soup. Right? PhDs and DAs and assistant chiefs and judges, and I kind of got to think, why am I here? My goodness, I'm just a guy who, grew up as a son of a musician, always been around people that had used marijuana in my life, and now I work for NORML, and I am the chapter outreach coordinator. I help coordinate 177 chapters around the country and around the world, including some fine people from Dallas-Fort Worth and Waco, Texas, who are here today. I also run NORML Show Live on the NORML Network, which is a live daily talk radio show where for 2 hours a day I talk to the people and I interview the people involved, some of the people that are in this room that are involved in fighting this war on drugs. So I think maybe why I'm here is because while I don't have any of that school book education on the issue of marijuana, I have a ton of real-world experience here on the issue of marijuana. I'm thrilled here to be with Dr. Sabet, and we've gotten to speak a few times, and he's a wonderful man. And as far as people who have worked for the ONDCP goes, a very gracious person who has told me to my face he does not want to see me put in a cage for my use of marijuana, and I appreciate that. Thank you. But it is kind of intimidating because, you know, the man's going to Harvard and getting a PhD at Harvard. I mean, my biggest academic achievement was I was the Boise State mascot in 1985. Go Broncos. I mean, he's worked in the White House. I once ate at a Waffle House. So, you know. But again, I think where I bring something to this debate is that I have skin in the game. I began smoking marijuana on July 4th, 1990, in a resort town called McCall, Idaho, with the guitar players in the band that I was playing with at that time. And I remember when that joint first went around the circle. And remember, my father is a drug addict and an alcoholic, and I'd always been told, just say no, drugs are bad, MK, don't do it, just don't do it. And when I saw that joint go around, I thought, oh my God, I'm in a band with guys that do drugs. These guys do drugs. And I refused it the first couple times it came around. And I was really shocked because when I did refuse it, I was a little worried because I'd heard about the peer pressure, and they all kind of went, okay. They just kept passing it around. And after about 4 or 5 or 6 passes of this, and them giggling and just having a good old time and not really being any problem, I finally took a puff. And when I took that puff, I went, this is drugs? Really? This is what you were warning me about? I mean, I'd been drinking since age 16. I'd woken up in strange places. I'd had tequila scars. I mean, I puked on my shoes. I've done some terrible things under alcohol. And when I smoked that joint, I went, really? This was the problem? It makes me happy and lightheaded and go to sleep and eat Funyuns? That's what we need to throw me in jail for? This is terrible. So I've got skin in the game. And because of that, under this war on drugs, I have been affected by this daily. The federal law right now for the possession of even a speck of marijuana is a misdemeanor with a possible 1-year prison term and a $1,000 fine. Now, it's probably not going to happen, but it exists. It's there. That law is there. And for the past few years, when I've been living in Oregon, I've been growing marijuana plants. And for just one marijuana plant, the federal penalty is a felony with 5 years, $250,000 fine. And if you're growing a lot of marijuana plants, like this fine woman's son is, you're actually eligible for the death penalty in this country.
And I'm proud of him.
Thank you, Mrs. Lee. Thank you. But a federal death penalty exists. We are one of 9 countries in the world that has a death penalty involved with marijuana. Now, you have to grow over 60,000 plants, make $2 million, $20 million over a certain number of years, continuing criminal enterprise, yada, yada, yada. But the fact exists, we have a death penalty for this plant. A death penalty. In Texas here, we heard some of the folks talk about that, the misdemeanor, 6 months, probation, $2,000 fine, mandatory rehab. A plant is felony, 12 years, $10,000 fine. In Florida, it's 5-year felony for anything 21 grams or over. 21 of those sugar packets, 21 grams is about 3/4 of an ounce. Felony, 5-year sentence, $100,000 fine, and you lose your right to vote. And in Florida, you lose your right to vote as a felon permanently. After 5 to 7 years, you can apply to a clemency board to maybe get your right to vote back. This has resulted in 8.2% of all Floridians of voting age being disenfranchised and 19.8% of African American voters being disenfranchised in the state of Florida. It's really hard to change the laws that criminalize you when you can't vote to change them. Even in my home state of Oregon, where people think, oh, it's all hippy-dippy, liberal, love fest, pot and love and patchouli and all that. Yes, it is decriminalized. Less than an ounce is a ticket. You do get a 6-month driver's license suspension, even if you weren't driving, and a $1,000 fine. But over an ounce in the state of Oregon is a felony, 10-year sentence, $100,000 fine. We go from 28 grams as a ticket to 29 grams is a 10-year felony. So it isn't even good even in the state of Oregon, where people think it's all hippy-dippy sun and light. And the folks here, and when I saw a slide up there that said, oh, there's only 0.3% of people in prison and 0.1. Well, first of all, sucks for them, huh? But for all the rest of the things that happen that have nothing to do with being in prison or being arrested. First of all, if you've been arrested, you can be considered a drug criminal for the rest of your life. That follows you around. If you're a student, you can lose your financial aid, because if someone's got a drug problem, the last thing we want them to have is a college education. You can lose your federal housing for being arrested for marijuana. It can be used against you in child custody cases. And these aren't just abstracts to me. These are my friends. Every person I know smokes marijuana. Every person I know and interact with directly smokes marijuana. And not just the, oh, I smoked a joint at the class reunion. I'm talking daily and weekly marijuana smokers, and not just medical smokers, people like me who just like to smoke pot. That's all we like, just like to smoke pot. And even without the arrest, we've got people here like myself who've been living in fear of police officers. When I saw this assistant chief up here talking about, the neighborhoods and the cities, I thought back to all the times when I wanted to call a cop, I wanted to interface with a police officer, but that thought was in the back of my head, better not. Are you sure you don't got something on you? You sure you're not going to come back to your house and want to check things out? You sure you're not going to want to bring a dog to your car? How many crimes go unreported? How many women live in domestic violence situations where they won't report the guy beating them because, well, they've got drugs and they might lose their kid? I mean, the tendrils of this are so intertwined, and I talk and deal with these people every day. And the bottom line is that this war on drugs essentially says to me, Russ Belville, the federal government thinks you ought to be in a cage because you like to smoke pot. Now, if you'd like to go home and drink, you can drink Crown Royal until you pass out. That's fine. If you want to smoke, you can buy cigarettes and smoke until you get lung cancer and die. Don't got a problem with that. But if you want to smoke a little pot that never killed anyone, makes you happy and want to eat Funyuns, makes jazz sound good, we got to put you in a cage. And I just think that's fundamentally wrong. Now, to this question, the war on drugs has failed. Is legalization the answer? Well, as Russ Jones, the very well-named Russ Jones said, we don't have a war on drugs, we have a war on people. I have never seen a DEA agent point an automatic weapon at a marijuana plant. But a few of my friends working in dispensaries have had automatic weapons pointed at their heads. A few people that I've reported on have had armor-clad thugs breaking into their homes, throwing flashbang grenades, wearing body armor, shooting their dogs while their children are in the house. But I have never seen them point that gun at a plant. And while it is a war on people, it's not really a war on all people who use drugs. Like comedian Paul Mooney once said, I have the complexion of protection. I'm a middle-aged white guy. I'm not going to get busted for weed. Probably never. Probably never. So it's not a war on people who use drugs. It's a war on some people who use drugs. And wait a minute, it's not even really a war on drugs, because in this society we celebrate drugs. You can't turn on TV without seeing another drug ad. I mean, we got beer ads funding the Super Bowl. We got Viagra ads everywhere. Look, what's up with those two people in the bathtubs anyway? I don't get that. And we got the cartoon depression. Have you seen those drugs through the cartoon, the Abilify, where the woman's got depression? Is your antidepressant not helping? And she's got that robe of depression she wears around. Well, if that pill doesn't help you, we've got another pill to help the pill that doesn't help you. And notice that the depression robe never really goes away. It still kind of hangs out off to the side. We're not curing anything. We're managing it, because that's the comeback. That's where they get the comeback at the pharmaceutical company. So it's not a war on all people who use all drugs. It's just some people using some drugs. And in fact, we celebrate drugs. Even the evil drugs, cigarettes, even the evil one, the one we all know is awful and terrible, we at least tolerate it. I used to work at a company that had paid for by the company a shelter outside, because we're in Portland, Oregon, it rains a lot, right? A shelter outside so the nicotine addicts could go and get their fix. Sounds different when I say it that way than smoke break, doesn't it? Nicotine addicts to get their fix, paid for by the company, and willing to accept the productivity loss of people heading out every 2 hours for 15 minutes to do their drugs. So don't tell me we have a war on drugs, that we think drugs are bad. It's just some drugs and some of the people that are using them are bad. And when we call it a war on drugs, it's not even really a war on drugs, it's a war on marijuana. As was cited earlier, 52% of all arrests in the war on drugs are for marijuana, 88% for possession alone. Here in Texas, it's 97% of all marijuana arrests are for possession, as they were talking about trace amounts and such too. So what we really have here is not a war on drugs. What we have here is a war on certain American citizens using non-pharmaceutical, non-alcoholic, tobacco-free drugs. That's what we have. So the first premise of the question, the war on drugs, is kind of not exactly a true premise. And the other part is, has failed. Has failed at what? What has it really failed at? Because if you look at this with the right perspective, the war on drugs is an incredible success. I mean, if you own pharmaceutical stock and you're worried about medical marijuana competing with Xanax or Paxil or Prozac or any of those drugs or the opiate drugs that you sell, well, the war on drugs is doing great to keep that natural cheap competition out of your market. If you are an owner of prison stocks or you work as a prison guard in California where the median income for a prison guard is $74,000 a year. By the way, speaking of well-funded drug lobby, that's twice my salary. If you're a cop and you want to keep your thumb down on a certain neighborhood and a certain class of people, there's nothing better than the war on drugs for collecting fingerprints, getting people in the system, being able to shake them down, maybe find some other crime they might be up to. And if you're trying to provide jobs for underskilled, undereducated people, those jobs that have flown out to Mexico and China, the factory jobs, the manufacturing jobs we don't have anymore, the war on drugs is an incredible success in providing underground income for people, for keeping unemployment rates below what they would really be if we looked at inner city neighborhoods and tried to find out. I mean, already what's the black unemployment in most inner city neighborhoods? In the 15s, 20s, 30s? How much higher would it be if the kids that were dealing had to apply for unemployment instead? We would see massive amounts of unemployment. So if the war on drugs is all about creating jobs for cops and rehabs and prison guards and kids dealing in the streets, it's an amazing success. But let's take it at its face. Let's take it what we're really intending here. The war on drugs is a failure because of what Nixon said, right? Nixon said we're going to do a war on drugs, we're going to end abuse and dependence and reduce the harms and all that. Well, people who've been up here before have already told you all about that it hasn't really worked. So, is legalization the answer? Well, again, depends. Is it the answer to stopping all people from ever getting high and using drugs and never causing any harms? Not at all. No, no. In fact, if you legalize, as some people have suggested, there might be a slight uptick. There might be some people that had never tried pot who think, well, it's legal now, let me give it a shot. There might be people using pot now who think, oh, well, now that it's accessible and cheaper, I'll use more of it. But again, people are smoking pot now, and I haven't yet seen much harm from that in the first place. Maybe the legalization is the answer if our goal is to reduce harm. The harm of the crime and the prohibition-related violence, the harm of kids dealing in the high school parking lots, then maybe it is the answer. But for this entire question, I reject the initial premise. I reject the entire initial premise that it's any of the government's business or wherewithal or desire to stop me from smoking pot. I don't see the need to do so. I have been an employed citizen. I have worked and paid taxes for 20 years. I've consulted on Wall Street. I've worked in hospitals. I've done IT work, some of the most complex brain mechanics that you can get involved with, doing network analysis and such. I always figure if Carl Sagan could smoke pot, so could I. And it didn't seem to hurt my brain much either. So when people are talking about this war on drugs, you always have to boil it down to the fact that we're talking about arresting people and messing with their lives in an attempt to stop them from smoking pot. And we must address, is that even really something that's worth doing? Somebody said, the DA here said, or the assistant chief, what if we had a stone society? Oh, we'd end up with a stone society. Heaven forbid we have more people that are mellow, get along with each other, laugh, eat some Funyuns now and then. Oh, what a terrible world it would be. Now, I don't mean to diminish the problems of other drugs. I have experience in that realm too. Like I said, my father's a drug addict. My father was addicted to speed. He was addicted to marijuana. He was addicted to alcohol mostly an alcoholic. But for all those years, my dad was an alcoholic, and I was suffering as a child from the things that happened. Him being away for 2 weeks at a time, him getting all drunk and a little wacky in the house, and the terrible things that happened to me as a kid. Not once did any group of cops ever try to break down the door, threw in a flashbang grenade, and haul my dad off for my well-being. Never happened. But if it had been the pot, they'd have done that. We let people be alcoholics, but we don't throw them in prison for it. We do deal with their alcoholism if it causes problems to other people. But for the alcohol itself, we don't throw them in prison. And this is happening not just to random statistics. I mean, I can give you the stats. 102 million people have tried it. 26 million people in America will smoke pot this year. That's more tokers than Texans. You know, they said don't mess with Texas. don't mess with tokers, okay? We are nothing to fear. There is nothing scary about us. Our smoking pot is not going to cause us to run riot in the streets, go crazy, start shooting heroin or anything like that. We are productive, responsible, law-abiding citizens. Now I know some of you might see, well, I see those pot rallies and all the tie-dye hippies and long hair and the piercings and the dreadlocks and, you know, they're a little crazy and they support Ron Paul and stuff. Whatever the stereotype you want to put in there. But understand that because of the illegality of marijuana, you are only seeing the tip of the iceberg. The people with nothing to lose. The people who can be out and proud. You're not seeing the doctors, the lawyers, the teachers, the cops even who use marijuana because they can't be out and proud. They can't talk about this. Now, and one more stat. 2.6 million people in America are just like me. They smoke pot every day this month. 2.6 million people smoke pot every day this month. That's more than the population of Houston, Texas. We cannot have a policy that says the entire population of Houston, Texas are criminals. It makes no sense. And finally, to wrap up, whenever we talk about this war on drugs and the other side wants to talk about what we're going to, what the effects might be, we get a lot of the muddying of the waters with weird statistics, things like, well, we can't legalize marijuana because alcohol and tobacco only bring in $40 billion worth of taxes, but they cost $400 billion worth of social effects. Yeah, that would be scary if marijuana were alcohol or tobacco. But alcohol and tobacco, if I'm not mistaken, kill people and are highly addictive. And marijuana is not. So I'm not scared by that. And there's a whole bunch, you know, we don't really lock people up. Not a whole lot of them. Well, even one person locked up for using marijuana is one too many. And finally, this idea that we want to cut the head off the snake. I heard that. We're going to cut the head off the snake. We're going to go after the big guns. The big guns like Patricia Spotted Crow, just north of us in Oklahoma, who's doing 12 years in prison for the sale of $31 worth of marijuana. 2 dime bags she sold. She's got 12 years in prison, separated from her children. What about the children, right? How about Dale Schaefer and Molly Fry, medical marijuana providers in California, growing marijuana under the state's Prop 215 in accordance and cooperation with their state, county, and local people, busted by the feds, now serving 5 years in prison each. Dr. Fry is a cancer survivor, breast cancer. She was growing it for other cancer survivors. She's in prison. And a friend of mine from Georgia, whose daughter was rousted from her bed in the middle of the night, 16 years old, grabbed by her hair by SWAT teams with assault rifles pointed at her head because some kid in her class narked her off for having a gram or two. These are real stories happening to real people. So why not legalize marijuana? Why not? Well, it's not harmless, but it's not alcohol. It's not tobacco. It's far less harmful than that. The results we've seen with alcohol and tobacco show that we can legalize the worst of drugs and yet bring down the harm from them through regulation and education. And it separates marijuana from those hard drugs that are truly devastating and cause the faces of meth that we were scandalized by. And finally, remember, when anybody, see, there we go. When anybody says that we need to continue what we're doing or make cosmetic changes around the edges, they are saying one of two things. Russ Belville needs to be in a cage, or Russ Belville needs to be forced into a rehab he doesn't need, forced to be mandatorily re-educated, forced to be P-tested when he's not causing harm to anyone. Thank you for your time.
Well, Russ, you're a real live wire. All right, now we'll have your program says that Kevin Sabet's a doctoral student. He's already actually has his PhD, which, as I said in an earlier session, means he knows what's good for people. So, and welcome, Kevin Sabet.
Wow, thanks. I'm going to walk around. No, you can time it. That'd be great. Thank you. Can you all hear me? Is this on? Yeah. Great. Well, I want to thank Bill Martin and the Baker Institute for having me here today and for getting into a really robust discussion, which I think is helpful and useful for us as we talk about compelling issues of public policy. We need them discussed in the public square. And as someone actually who really much appreciated Rick Steves' talk last night, even though I may not agree with him, I think we do need to discuss this. We do need to expand our minds and talk about the diversity of opinions. I'll also thank Russ for his, I'll say, eloquent and live-wired, I think was the good adjective, speech and talk today about legalization. And I'm happy to see people giving Russ a standing ovation. He deserves it. I actually went to, my undergraduate was at Berkeley, and I was part of a group that was a bunch of people who were concerned with public heroin use in parks, and also with marijuana and other drugs, and they were part of a group called Citizens for a Drug-Free Berkeley, which you can imagine was about as popular as the Coalition for a Wine-Free France. So I'm happy that we may have some different opinions in the audience, and I like that. That's the kind of discussion that I think is helpful for us. But to get to the issues, I think we need to talk about the spectrum that Ethan laid out earlier, which I also thought was very helpful. That you have on one side this sort of Milton Friedman's wet dream, as he put it, and on the other side this extreme version of prohibition, jackbooted thugs, people in jail for small amounts, etc. And it is true that there is a discussion that needs to be had somewhere in the middle of that actually rises above either of those paradigms, because I think that oftentimes we're given this kind of proposition, all or nothing, legalization versus prohibition. And that's great for the media, it's great for sort of pro-con op-ed pages, but we do lose a lot of the nuance that I think does need to be discussed. And while I appreciate and understand what Russ is saying about his friends and some of the anecdotes that he had about everybody that he knows, although he knows me now and I don't smoke marijuana, so there's one person who doesn't smoke, I think that it is important to use the data, and not selectively. You know, I realize that we don't have the best data in this field because it's an underground market. It's hard to study something that's illegal, but we do have a good amount of data that we should try and draw on. First of all is the data of who uses, how many users of drugs there are in this country. And if you look at marijuana, this is 2009, it would have risen to close to 7% for last year. But if you compare it to cigarettes and alcohol, you know, there are obviously far less people using those legal drugs, those illegal drugs versus the legal drugs, cigarettes and alcohol. And to me, as someone who's interested in statistics, I think the data and the evidence do need to tell us what's going on so we can make more informed public policies. That is an interesting statistic to me, and I'm concerned about that. Because when you look at alcohol and tobacco in our society, and Russ sort of mentioned this but kind of belittled it, but I would pose it again to say it is something that we need to think about. Because I know that state legislators and others are thinking about marijuana as a moneymaker or other drugs as a moneymaker. But that was, remember, one of the principled arguments for the repeal of prohibition. And if any of you saw Ken Burns' excellent documentary on PBS, he pointed out that one of the principal arguments that prohibition was repealed was the promise that we would not have an income tax in this country, that being able to tax alcohol was going to be more than enough that we would need, that we would not need an income tax. And in reality, when you look at alcohol and tobacco and those costs, they obviously dwarf any revenues that are brought in. We talk about, you know, alcohol, $14 billion to about $185 billion in lost productivity, healthcare costs, etc. And that's no accident. I mean, the revenues number, and we can focus on the costs, and a lot of people on my side like to focus a lot on the harms, but let's actually focus on the revenues for a second. Why are they so low? Well, they're low because we have a multi-billion-dollar industry, very influential in Washington. I worked within 3 administrations, Clinton, Bush, and Obama, and we contended with the alcohol industry often. They're out there loud and proud and powerful. They have every incentive in the world to keep taxes low as they can, so that more people drink. Because we know from economics that the lower you keep the price of these kinds of commodities, the more users you have. And so they have an incentive. You know, I always chuckle when I'm watching the Super Bowl or any football game and you see those wonderful beer ads, which are the funniest ads of all. No mistake, by the way, that that's the case. They're marketing to kids. But when you look at those ads, I chuckle at the last line of every ad, or if you look in the fine print, it says, "Drink responsibly." Have you seen that? Okay. If the alcohol industry wanted you to drink responsibly, they would be all out of business. They only make their money from heavy drinkers. They have a built-in incentive to maximize drug use. And frankly, I am worried about that. Rick talked yesterday about corporations, and he's worried about that. And we actually had a nice conversation, 15 minutes in the car, one-on-one, talking about this. And I am very worried about the Marlboroization, the Budweiserization of marijuana or other drugs. If we think that that's not going to happen in this country, a country whose Supreme Court said commercial speech is free speech, we're being very naive to think that it's going to be a grow your own and goodbye. So I am very worried about that. I'm also worried about, tobacco. In the era of the highest tobacco taxes in the world, the highest tobacco taxes we've ever had in this country, it still costs about a tenth of the cost of tobacco. And there's been a lot of discussion today about tobacco versus marijuana. Tobacco kills 500,000 people directly a year. Marijuana doesn't kill anybody directly from overdose. That's true. But we also have to look at the indirect costs. I mean, you can smoke a tobacco cigarette, and drive a car. You are not impaired. There is no connection. That's not the case with marijuana. British Medical Journal last week, and these are independent studies, pot doubles car crash risk. I mean, you can say that's not true, but that's peer-reviewed journals. And again, we can talk about this when we're advocates, but I like to look at the data. The biggest thing I hear is, if we only treated it like alcohol, we would just get the criminal justice system out of it. Well, that's actually not true, because alcohol is responsible for more arrests in this country, and this is not violence related to alcohol. I mean, we would need a screen twice the size as big to fit that cop car in there to represent the millions of arrests for violence. This is only the violation of liquor laws and driving under the influence. So it's public intoxication, it's liquor laws, liquor regulations, and violence. Marijuana-related arrests, all of them 847,000. The idea that we're going to get the criminal justice system out of the picture if we legalize marijuana, I think is very, very difficult when you look at the evidence on our legal drug, which needs to be our example today of alcohol. And it's very surprising. In fact, 2.7 million is double the amount for all drugs combined. So add crack, add meth, add everything else in there, you're still looking at 2.7 million arrests. We're not going to get rid of the criminal justice system. We're going to actually increase costs. What will we do? What will happen with use? A lot of people have thrown around this idea, well, there may be a short-term increase in use, and then it'll taper off as it gets more normalized. Well, the independent RAND Institute, nothing to do with the federal government on this, on their own. And if you look at the co-founder of the RAND drug policy people, many of them are my colleagues. Actually, most of them disagree with me completely on the premise of marijuana legalization. So they're not in the can for the government on this one. But they did independent studies, independent report, and found that the price will drop at more than 80% when you legalize. Obviously, the underground market, that's an incentive, is to increase costs, increase price. Consumption will increase. Nobody knows by how much, and I'm not going to come up here and tell you that it's going to be tripled and times 10, and we're going to be walking around like zombies. We don't know by how much, but we know consumption will increase with legalization. You cannot argue that it will not, based on the economics and based on the evidence. And we also know, and based on this report and other economics reports, is that tax evasion will be a major concern. You got to remember, this is not like Al Capone prohibition in the 20s and 30s. And when you repealed it, they all went away, and that's going to happen right now with marijuana. Marijuana, if you want to compare Al Capone with the underground marijuana, underground drug trade today, that's like comparing the lemonade stand with Coca-Cola. There is no comparison. These are transnational criminal organizations. We actually changed the term in the Obama administrations. We did not call them drug trafficking organizations anymore, because that did not accurately describe what these organizations were. They're transnational criminal organizations. They're making money off kidnapping, extortion, piracy, things that 10 years ago you wouldn't have even imagined. And before, it was kidnapping in Mexico was in exchange for some political figure or in exchange for some knowledge. Now it's money. It's pure money to fuel what these people are doing. So the idea that they're going to kind of magically go away, especially if we only legalize marijuana, I think is very difficult. I talked about the alcohol drink responsibly. And I think we need to dispel some myths and go through a couple of things here. First of all, as Russ actually did acknowledge, I mean, no Western country is arresting and locking up people whose only crime and only offense is smoking marijuana. That doesn't mean that people who smoke marijuana who also are involved in other crimes aren't getting arrested. They are. And that doesn't mean that there aren't police abuses. Of course there are. And we need to identify those. I agree with Russ. When you're a middle-class white kid, you can smoke pot in your grandma's basement and you're not going to get arrested. When you have brown skin and you happen to be on the stoop or in public housing in public and your use is exposed to the public, you are more likely to get arrested. And we need to look at that. And that's why I think books like the New Jim Crow and others warrant a discussion and a reading so we can talk about these race issues, which, by the way, are a lot deeper than just law enforcement. So to sort of gloss over and say legalization is going to solve those issues, and by the way, the Mexico issue, and by the way, revenue, I don't buy it. I think if you look at the evidence, you would see things in contrary. The other distinguished panel is going to talk today about international experiences, but I think one of the things that Alex is here in his article said is that these experiments in Portugal and other parts of Europe, I think, have been overblown. They've been sort of people wanting to paint a very, very broad brush about about, look, this is legalization in action. Well, actually, nobody's legalized drugs. The Dutch haven't legalized even. They have the closest model selling to coffee shops. And while they do have less drug use than America, I will concede that easily. While they do have less drug use in America, they always had less drug use in America. In fact, America's always had the most number of drug users, although now that's changing. Actually, Iran is the highest drug-using country in the world per capita. But America traditionally has had that. And so this idea that, you know, the Dutch policy is a success because they have less drug users than America, I think it's more important to look within the Dutch society to see what happened. And Rob McCune and Peter Reuter, who I disagree on heroin maintenance about, I disagree on marijuana legalization about, we've gotten in a lot of spirited discussions. In their book, the book that Ethan praised this morning, Drug War Heresies, they talk about the doubling and tripling of Dutch youth marijuana use in that country when not only the law was changed, but they saw commercialization. So actually, it's sort of the opposite of what Rick was talking about yesterday and some others today, that you would see a sort of slight increase in the beginning and that would level off. The opposite happened in the Netherlands. You did not see an increase in the beginning. Well, you had the anti-drug norms. You had norms in society that had been in place for a while. Then sort of you go along 10 years down the road, kids growing up without those norms, and an industry saying, wait a minute, we can make a lot of money on this. That commercialization increase, and that actually is directly related to the increase in use that we saw in the Netherlands. And by the way, the Netherlands has the biggest marijuana treatment problem today in Europe. That's something to think about as well. A lot of people went through the statistics about state prisons and federal prisons. You know, when I was at ONDCP, this was something we really tried to get our head around. John referred to a '97 study. We looked at the '04 survey of inmates, which is something that the Bureau of Justice Statistics does. It's very difficult to do because you're going in, you're surveying inmates. But basically, we could not actually register marijuana-only possession with no priors. It was very difficult because when you go back into these criminal records, into dockets, you're looking at people, again, multiple things happening. You know, you get pulled over because you're speeding, then the policeman sees marijuana in your car. Yes, then you will be arrested for marijuana. That's recorded as marijuana. But we're not breaking down doors when we just suspect somebody may have a small amount of marijuana. And as I've said on many college campuses, and I'll say on this one, if we were doing that in the federal government, it would be a very easy task. We'd go to every college campus in the country, 1 mile radius with all the dorms, and you'd just do random searches of all the dorms and college campuses. You'd find a lot of marijuana. We'd be able to arrest a lot of people. Okay, that's not a focus of police resources. And actually, so this goes into Michelle Alexander's, the issue about drug offenses. Drug offenses really starting in the 2000s and the late 90s are not the majority of the growth. Well, they've never been the majority of the growth, but except in the 80s. But they have leveled off, whereas all offenses have increased. So I think it's important to, again, as John was saying earlier, just look a little bit more into the data rather than hear the talking point. It's important to see that. We talked a little bit about Mexico. Again, RAND did a study because of Prop 19, and they're based in California. They did a study looking at revenues from Mexican drug trafficking organizations, found about 15 to 25% of their revenues came from marijuana, not a majority, and that basically state-level legalization would have about a 2 to 4% impact on their revenues. That's not a surprise if you know what they're doing in Mexico and you've been privy to that information to see what kind of multi-layer corruption, not in the government anymore, I could say that, is going on. And to think that legalizing marijuana is going to take that away and solve those complex problems, we need to talk about, you know, institution building in Mexico. We need to talk about rule of law and training for law enforcement. We need to talk about education and a healthcare system in Mexico. We think legalizing marijuana is going to stop all of this? I just think that a lot of these things are brought in very naive. And finally, to kind of end on this, although I want to end on more of a positive note, but I think we have to be very careful about downplaying the harms of marijuana, as I've heard a lot today. And I'm not one here to say reefer madness, worst drug ever, you know, try it once, you're doomed, we're going to have stoners running around society, etc. I am not one to say that, and you can look in my record and things that I've said on marijuana. But I do think it's important to point out the harm that does exist with today's marijuana, which is not the Woodstock, as Russ actually said, I think recently publicly, not your grandfather's Woodstock weed, and I liked that. And that's true. And I get, listen, I'm 33 years old, okay? I've talked to people, I talked to the head of, well, not the head, but the sort of number 2, number 3 guy at some big marijuana legalization organizations back in the 70s. And he enlightened me and told me, you know, back in the 70s, this was about protesting the Vietnam War. This was about being upset because your friends with long hair were being arrested for no reason. And this was about, you know, black people in the South going to jail for 30 years for no reason. It meant a lot to us. And I wasn't privy to that social phenomenon, and I can't identify with it, but I can understand where that's coming from. I'm not talking about that. I know that's important, and we should talk about that. But frankly, when I'm talking about crafting today's public policies, I'm worried about the evidence today. I'm worried about the latest scientific evidence and what non-biased research is telling me. And so I don't have all of that baggage. Rick talked yesterday about baggage. And I think a lot of us in this field have a lot of that baggage, because this was about our friends being arrested because they were protesting the war, et cetera. I'm not concerned with those cultural wars. I'm concerned with today's marijuana being a lot more powerful than it used to, and about a 9% addiction rate in terms of all of those who ever use. So 1 in 10, 1 in 11 people who will ever start using, and Russ said there have been 100 million users, that's true, who have ever tried. Most stop after the first time. But 1 out of every 10, there is an addiction. Again, this is peer-reviewed science, it's not the government. And tobacco is much more addictive than heroin, as Ethan said earlier. 1 in 3 versus 1 in 4 for heroin. So 3 out of 4 people who try heroin will not be addicted. Doesn't mean we don't care about it. About 1 out of every 10 people who drive drunk will have an accident and kill somebody. That doesn't mean that I'm not concerned about drunk driving. So we need to put some of these statistics into perspective a little bit. And I know it's easy and fun to talk about our friends and our one experience. And my neighbor, by the way, smoked tobacco cigarettes for 60 years. He died of natural causes at age 90. That is not important when you talk about public policy. What's important is the data. Dependence on specific drugs, marijuana dwarfs all of the other ones. In an era where you had basically a stabilizing of marijuana, you had a double amount of people going to treatment admissions. Half of them were from the criminal justice system. So this is the criminal justice system that's actually working with treatment. So not locking you up forever. Working with treatment, people that do have a problem. Russ takes offense to that because he doesn't want to be put in rehab. Last time I checked, he's not in rehab, neither are any of his friends. So this isn't about rounding up everybody and doing things against their will. You want to go smoke pot and grow it on your own and wherever you live and have a wonderful life and not interact with society and not, God bless you, go for it. Who am I to say that you shouldn't do that? I'm not concerned with that. I'm concerned with the public policy and the public health policy around increased marijuana use. And alcohol is our example of that. So this is the percentage THC increase from the 80s, tripling. And 10% is the bad stuff. I think the marijuana smokers in this room may be able to tell us. I'm not going to go into medical marijuana too much, but I think it's important that we acknowledge that there are medical properties within the marijuana plant, just like there are medical properties within the opium plant, et cetera, and medical properties within willow bark, because that, God bless us, that's where aspirin comes from. But it doesn't mean that we're going to say to people, smoke opium in an unstandardized dose from somebody who is not a doctor and where this has not been standardized in a lab, just because it's a God's herb or God's plant, and smoke opium to get the effects of morphine. I think the sick and dying and the truly ill deserve much, much more than that. I think they deserve standardization. I think that they deserve dose-to-dose consistency. I think they deserve a medicine that isn't named, Jerry Garcia Special and Super Silver Haze. Now, I know this is a fear of big pharma lately, and I get it. And we need to look at health care. I worked in the Obama administration. I think that's very important to look at health care issues in this country and the disproportionate health care issues in this country that affect certain people. But I also think that we need to ensure that our medicines are safe and effective and have consistency. And so you don't have to go to a dispensary from somebody that knows how to grow marijuana but doesn't have that scientific background. I'm concerned with that. And I know this scares a lot of the advocates, but there are drugs coming up the pipeline today that are marijuana-based, and the federal government's engaged in a robust research effort. In this country, there are phase 3 clinical trials. By the way, you can sign up if you need to. I'm serious, for MS spasticity and cancer pain, with a drug called Sativex, which is a mouth spray that's basically half THC and half another component called CBD, which is cannabidiol. And it is standardized. And I know that offends a lot of people because they see big pharma and they see money making. And again, that's an issue we do need to look at. But I think more important is an issue of making sure that our medicines are safe enough for those who truly are sick and dying. 90% of people in California admit that they do not have a chronic illness who use medical marijuana dispensaries. So that's an issue we also need to talk about. But for the small percentage, who am I to deny that sick and dying person their medicine? I'm not. And I'm concerned, and that's why we need to do that. So I think there are many ways to reduce incarceration. I am concerned with the increasing rates of incarceration in this country. That does concern me. But there are many ways to work on that without legalizing drugs. I do think that that is a radical solution. I do think that opening this up to the industries like alcohol and tobacco are worrisome. And so, and I have to finish up, there are a lot of things we can work on, whether it's prevention, treatment, recovery, smart enforcement efforts. I'm not going to have time to talk about it, but Google Project Hope Hawaii. It'll change what you think about law enforcement dealing with drugs and the treatment system in this country. Google the Drug Market Initiative, which is going on all across this country, which is basically giving people, dealers, more than users, a second chance, and linking them with economic, housing, and employment opportunities. I think that's the kind of uplifting message and policy message that we want to try and bring. And just a final message on reentry into society for those people who have been incarcerated. I am also concerned about people with petty and minor offenses on their records following them the rest of their life. It is a travesty that they're denied college education and that they're denied those loans. It is a travesty that they're denied housing or are randomly tested to keep that housing. That I agree with. And we need to work on those things and remove those barriers. But we can remove those barriers without opening up this can of worms. And I'm not saying that we're going to all go to hell and the society's going to, but I do see alcohol and tobacco as our cautionary tale. And I'm not advocating for the prohibition of alcohol. Some people will think that's inconsistent. But alcohol has a totally different widespread history in our culture. I get marijuana was used 5,000 years ago. I know that. But from a widespread point of view, alcohol takes the cake. And we've made a cultural decision to make that drug legal. And actually, most people in public health would say cultural accident, okay? We're not talking about that today. But I don't want to make that same accident with marijuana. Doesn't mean we're throwing everyone in jail for it. We need to focus on prevention and treatment. And tobacco and alcohol show that even that tax revenue, putting it to prevention and treatment is a pipe dream, pardon the pun, because it's not nearly going to cover enough when you increase access, availability, and use. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to a robust discussion. Thanks.
I'm excited to understand finally why I belong in a cage. Apparently it's clear. Let me address a few of these points. It keeps coming back to the alcohol and tobacco, and the taxes don't cover what the costs of alcohol and tobacco are. And like I said, yeah, because alcohol and tobacco are toxic and addictive. Marijuana, there was a study that was done in Canada on what was the enforcement costs and what was the public health costs of one individual Canadian drug user. Just on a per person, per year basis, what are the costs? When they looked at alcohol, the cost of enforcing alcohol laws in Canada is about $160, $165 per person. The public health cost was about $155 per person. So you're spending $165 to deal with $155 worth of problem. With tobacco, the public health cost was about $800 per Canadian. Obviously, because, you know, lung cancer, all the terrible diseases and you know, health risks of tobacco. Enforcement cost was about zero. It was almost negligible, because really tobacco enforcement, not a whole lot to it, right? You know, card kids for ID, but it's not like you have tobacco DUI stings that you have to put together, or, you know, the things you'd have to do for alcohol. When they looked at this, and the Canadian study looked at this for cannabis, they found that the cost of enforcing the cannabis laws in Canada was $384 per cannabis user, and it was saving $20 in public health costs. $384 spent to save $20. And that's what we would see here in the United States as well. Cannabis is not alcohol or tobacco. And it's disingenuous to continue saying, well, alcohol shows us or tobacco shows us, when cannabis is a completely different thing. Let's look at it for what it is and not try to compare it to things that are far more toxic and addictive. Yeah, please do.
Okay. I mean, obviously, cannabis is not tobacco or alcohol. Well, neither is crack, by the way. Alcohol is connected to crime in ways that crack is not, just so you know, right? We know that alcohol is related to violent crime in ways that PCP is not. So, yes, these drugs are very different, and they have relative different addictive potential, as the chart showed. I think marijuana, given the driving while intoxicated issues, given the other intoxication issues that it does to the brain changes on the adolescent developing brain, etc., is closer to alcohol, although they have very different effects. I mean, yeah, I'll grant you, marijuana makes you mellow, alcohol makes you a bit high-strung in a sense, to put it mildly. but a lot closer than tobacco and marijuana, which, again, tobacco, you can build a bridge and have a tobacco cigarette dangling from your mouth. You can drive a car. It is very different. Now, it's also very different in that tobacco is more toxic to the lungs and does cause 500,000 deaths a year, where marijuana doesn't. Marijuana does have lung damage, but it's different. So I acknowledge that they're different, but I look at those are the examples in society that we have to look at of legalized drugs. So when you look at those examples and you look at the costs and benefits, I think it's important to see that as a lesson.
When we keep talking about alcohol, we point out people drink and drive, and there's lots of deaths from drinking and driving, and there's lots of harms from alcoholism and the violence and the abuse. And yet, we still trust adults to be able to handle drinking alcohol responsibly. You know, you mentioned the alcohol
a horrible
commercials.
job at trusting at that, because alcohol causes all that harm. Again, and I think we're not talking about alcohol prohibition right now, but you look at it from a public health perspective, and I think the term cultural accident is very apropos. So that's a cultural decision that we've made based on that, and maybe we'll make a cultural decision in marijuana at some time as well. But I think they do have very different cultures that we need to look at.
Right, and part of the culture under marijuana is a culture of outlaws. Is a culture of people who are never given the message that there is responsible use. You get that fine print at the end of the alcohol ad that says drink responsibly. There is no similar message for marijuana to explain to people how to be responsible about it. Now, we at NORML try to do that, say don't drive, don't endanger others, no minors, set and setting, and so forth. But we can't begin to make that cultural change so long as marijuana is illegal.
So I have a question then for you on that, if I can ask a question now. Is that if we are looking at marijuana to be legal, and you're saying that you're going to have some age limits on it, given that those age limits do not work, barely work for alcohol, although we do know 21 is better than 18 in terms of drunk driving. We have analysis that looks at that. We saved a few thousand lives based on that, increasing that age. But how do we think that we're going to keep marijuana away from kids? I'm not saying that kids can't get marijuana now, so don't go there on the availability thing. I get it. They can. Mm-hmm. But why do we think that legalization would then restrict it even more, given our experience with alcohol and tobacco today and young people getting it? That's a genuine question.
Well, the threat of putting me in a cage for responsibly smoking a joint isn't stopping the kids from smoking the marijuana now.
But there's far less users of marijuana than alcohol.
We don't know that because we haven't legalized marijuana. We don't know how much more use of marijuana there would be.
But I'm saying right now, given that it's illegal, and I'm arguing for that, and you're arguing for a change in policy, with today's policies, there are far less users of marijuana than tobacco and alcohol. You don't agree?
No, there are less users of marijuana than alcohol and tobacco, but I could also note that the legalization and the regulation and education surrounding alcohol and tobacco have taken 12th grade lifetime use of alcohol down from 92% in 1976 to somewhere around 74% today. Lifetime use of tobacco among same 12th grade cohort from 75% in 1976 to around 44% today, to a point where there's less kids smoking tobacco than pot.
Right, and I acknowledge that this year we did see that, and I think that's troubling. But if you look at alcohol as an example, we have far more kids using it, and so that access translates to them using it. So I don't see how making it illegal is going to reduce kids using marijuana.
Right, making it illegal has not reduced kids from using marijuana. Making it legal at least provides the point where we have regulated stores that are selling it. We have people that are checking IDs for it. We have people, clerks or stores that can be given the stings. There was a recent story I just covered in Englewood, Colorado, where they did a alcohol sting using officers between the ages of 18 and 20 with IDs, with regular IDs, not fake IDs, with regular IDs. And they went to 28 of these different bars in Englewood, Colorado, and they found that about 24% of the bars would serve these guys even after they showed their ID 18 to 20. Right? But when they went to the dispensaries in Englewood, they found you couldn't even get in the door without showing your medical marijuana recommendation and ID. I still believe legalization and regulation gives us far more control.
But you're assuming the black market is going to go away under legalization.
I don't assume the black market's going to go away.
Okay, so we're still going to have that. So we're still going to have people and dealers who don't check IDs and people who
and they have to
compete
with a legal regulated market that they can't.
That they will undercut easily when we tax it, because that's the #1 argument, is that we legalize it and tax it. Well, when you do that, because that's that's been the argument of state legislators, you will still have that black market. In Canada, when they added a $2 tax to cigarettes, they saw a black market emerge, and they immediately had to repeal it. In New York City right now, the biggest underground drug problem, one of the biggest, is not cocaine, crack, or meth, or any of that. It is tobacco, because they increased the prices on tobacco, so you have from the south the runners to the north, and that's been a huge underground issue. So this idea that that is going to go away under legalization when it is so embedded and so endemic, I don't see how that's going to happen.
I think we agree there's always going to be a demand for drugs, and there's always going to be someone who supplies those drugs. And I've heard it said here in a previous, I think it was one of your slides, where you said, well, the Mexican drug trafficking organizations, these transnational criminals, it only accounts for 15 to 25% of their revenues. So why do we give criminals any business? Why do we want to fund them in any way?
But we don't know. That's my point, is, Russ, we don't know that those are going to go away under legalization, that 15 to 25% is even going to be denied. Assuming even that's going to be denied. Best case scenario, 25% denied. 75% of their revenue still comes from the other drugs, and it still comes from the other activities. But to think that they are just going to go away because you've legalized it and taxed it, they make such a profit margin, they will simply undercut that.
Well, of course they're not going to go away. Criminals are criminals. They do criminal things. That's why they're criminals. The question is, how much business should we give them? How many opportunities and how many markets?
When you're talking in the hundreds of billions of dollars, I'll tell you that, you know, they can take the cut.
Okay,
and so,
let's cut them.
Yeah, but how do we know that we were even going to be able to do that, is my question.
Let's try it and find out. This is the thing that just, it frustrates me to no end, is this idea that we have to subsidize these criminals to be able to run marijuana crimes, or else if we don't, they're going to turn and do other more desperate, violent crimes. Well, yeah, they're criminals. That's what they're going to do. But one thing they cannot do is manufacture drug demand out of whole cloth. People that smoke pot generally don't want to do meth. They generally don't want to do heroin. Those people able to get legal pot at a dispensary or whatever it might be that's regulated aren't going to turn to Mexican
There's a legal
meth.
market today in California. Anybody with a pulse can get a card to legally obtain marijuana today in California. I think we can acknowledge that. Okay, I think everybody acknowledges it. I mean, your boss, Alan St. Pierre, on national TV said California has legalized marijuana. Okay, so we know that. So there's still a black market in California for marijuana. I mean, I haven't seen it gone away. So I'm even giving you the benefit of the doubt on the 25%, but that's questionable.
But that
we're even going to be able to deny them that.
That black market is far, far smaller than it was before. Before California had Prop 215 and medical marijuana, you could sell a pound of marijuana wholesale for $2,500 to $3,000. Now that price is down to $200 to $1,500. There's not as much money to be made at it by the people that are doing it illegally anymore.
I look forward to seeing that data, but again, we're concerned when the price goes down that consumption is going to increase.
And again, I say, I don't see that a priori that is necessarily something that is a bad thing. I think it's a bad thing when people use marijuana and do bad things. Yes, if they abuse it. But what we have here is a system that treats all use of marijuana as if it were abuse. It says Russ Belville needs to be put in a cage because some kid might smoke a joint. Russ Belville needs to be put in a cage because somebody might drive stone.
That's my point. The practical reality, you're not in a cage. Nobody's
but I could be at any moment.
I thought it was supposed to. You were supposed to mellow you out a little bit. Hold on, but the point is there are 100 million people who have tried marijuana, and most of them are not in a cage. And if you look at the statistics of those who are, they haven't been incarcerated. And for those are deep racial issues, ma'am. Do you think that's going to go away if we legalize marijuana? Will the race issue go away, people? Of course not. There are underlying issues that we need to deal with.
All right,
and it's a faulty assumption to think that they would be dealt with that way. But so we can agree to disagree.
On to the user.
Well, that is a question I wanted to ask you, Kevin, because we've got a lot of stats up here. National Institutes of Drug Abuse say there's a 9% lifetime dependence rate on marijuana. Am I an addict?
No, it's not the National Institute on Drug Abuse.
Am I an addict?
I have no idea, and so you're not going to rope me into some you versus Russ. I don't know. I think you're a great guy, so I don't know if you're an addict or not. And I, frankly, like I said,
use marijuana
God bless
every
you
day.
and good luck.
At least 5 to 7 times every day.
God bless you. I'm concerned with the problematic marijuana use that is happening in society.
But again, I'm the marijuana user who is using it more than almost any other marijuana user. Like I said, 5 to 7 times a day I smoke marijuana. I'm that user. I'm that heavy chronic user. And again, the not your father's Woodstock weed, that always cracks me up when Marinol is 100% THC.
That's what you said.
I know. I'm quoting the drug warriors.
Even though we didn't get everything settled, and I think that I'm trying to imagine how lively you would be if you didn't smoke marijuana prior to that.
I would be in trouble.
But
Some would say that's my medical use.
that's right. But we are going to try to stay on time all the day. Here's the plan now. I believe it is the case that we will have lunches, box lunches for everyone here. I could be wrong about that. If you have RSVP'd, you're safe. And so you might want to, if you didn't, you might want to hold back a little. But I think we have enough lunches out there for everyone. If you find that you don't, there is several food things over in the Rice Memorial Center, which I'm not sure I'm pointing the right direction. But when you go out, it'll be that way. That's right. There are several places, but if you do decide to eat there, please come back. We're going to start showing the film, a video of Michelle Alexander giving her talk about the new Jim Crow at 12:30 in the other room, so you'll be able to we can eat more easily there, and then we'll come back in here afterwards. Yes, we'll come back in here afterwards at 1.
All righty. Good job. Thanks.